Welcome to the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show, a special NEI Podcast series. In this show, Dr. Andrew Cutler interviews Dr. Stephen Stahl on the most controversial, novel, and exciting topics in psychopharmacology today.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show. Today we are doing the third part of our series on psychedelics. And we're going to be talking with someone who really knows what he's talking about, and that's my friend Dr. Scott Aaronson from Sheppard Pratt. Scott, how are you?
I'm terrific, Andy. Good to be here.
Well, Scott, I'm afraid I'm going to have to out you and say what you told me a second ago. Scott is at the tip of the spear of the fastest and the slowest treatments we have in development right now, that being psychedelics and vagal nerve stimulation. And with us, of course, is the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Stephen Stahl. Steve, how are you?
Great. Hi, guys. Great to be here.
All right. Well, Steve and I have had some interesting conversations, Scott. We had a podcast where the two of us kind of set the stage, and we are really interested to hear what you have to say. So why don't we start off with what the psilocybin trials have been to date? What has been done with psilocybin so far?
So far, what we've got, the two leading studies that have both come out, the first one came out in November 2022. The other one came out this year. The first was the Compass Phase 2 trial of a synthetic psilocybin, randomized controlled trial of 3 different doses of psilocybin, 1, 10, and 25 milligrams. And then the study from USONA came out, I guess, a few months ago, which was for pretty much a generic version of psilocybin. And you know, what we're looking at is we're really looking at these early phase studies. I got to tell you, I don't know that the outcomes were as impressive in these randomized trials as we're likely to see as we go forward and figure out the paradigm better. But we certainly are seeing evidence for efficacy and good evidence to support further studies. I'm not sure what USONA is doing. I know that Compass is now engaged in the 2 different phase 3 trials, which will hopefully lead to being able to present things to the FDA, possibly as soon as 2025. But, you know, as ever, the other comment to make about psychedelic studies is I've been doing clinical trials for for probably 40 years. And these are some of the most complicated studies I've ever done just because of what the manpower involvement is and the screening process is. So very, very interesting studies, complicated studies to do. And the other thing is that the entire environment for the research of psychedelics reminds me of nothing so much as a 3-ring circus with lots of interested parties trying to, put forth their own idiosyncratic beliefs.
Yeah, that's really well said. There just seems to be a lot of almost faith-based thinking here, not as much critical scientific thinking. But you know, I have a quick question for you. That study that you referenced that you and Guy Goodwin published, why did you use 3 doses of psilocybin and no placebo?
It's complicated, and one of the big issues is that certainly when you're doing early studies, you want to figure out what your effective dose is.
Sure.
The other problem is what your placebo is.
Right.
So the idea behind using 110 and 25 milligrams is when it was first designed, we were unclear which way 10 milligrams would go. Would we show greater efficacy or not? So we, it's purposely chosen as a mid-range dose. The idea behind the 1 milligram is that it's not a placebo. It's a dose that may have effect and would be comparable in some ways to a microdose. of psilocybin. The other really complicated feature of these psilocybin studies, particularly the randomized ones, is there is so much expectation on the part of participants. When they don't have a psychedelic experience, often there is a lot of bad feelings involved. So it is complicated, but the idea behind it was to hopefully give some support that we were not using a placebo dose.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, of course, there's the usual dose finding that you would do, but it sounds like if you give placebo, there's the risk of unblinding. I mean, you clearly know who's getting a drug and who's not.
Yeah, and I think we need. I think one of the worst things, and actually you and Steve would be terrific commentators on this. I don't think that we have changed the way that we do clinical trials since the 1960s, and we really need to rethink do we need placebo-controlled trials when it's really hard to have a real placebo for psychedelics? The same way it's really hard to have a sham treatment for some neurostimulation paradigms. Do you feel something or not?
You're bringing up a great point, Scott, because I've actually written about this in terms of why placebo response rate is killing things even in a greater way than just in the psychedelic trials.
Yeah, and I know that my buddy Jerry Sanacora took a sabbatical to write. He's writing a book, I think it might be more geared to the lay public on placebos.
Really?
Because it certainly is, I've spent my whole career on the far end of the continuum dealing with severely treatment-resistant folks. So we have less of a placebo response rate there. But I got to say, for these really, really novel treatments like psychedelics, you're still going to get some issues around placebos. But the whole placebo response rate thing has been, in some ways, the death knell of getting anything approved for adolescents.
Yeah, I think worshiping at the altar of RCTs that are placebo-controlled maybe is so 20th century. And so I think we should be open to things. One of the things I wrote in an editorial a few years ago is, what about doing some post-randomization changes in statistics? For example, what if you didn't take your drug? And what if you took a drug that was, active control in the placebo group? Can you back these people out and only actually do a comparison of people who took drug? Things like that. But once you've randomized, you're not supposed to touch it. And so that the statisticians have an anaphylactic reaction to the suggestions like that. But I think we need to think more broadly, or we're going to kill innovation.
Absolutely.
Well, it's always been interesting to me. We're the only country in the world for which regulatory authorities require placebo-controlled trials. Everywhere else, you would use a gold standard treatment, non-inferiority or something like that. Yeah, Steve, you can pre-specify that, let's say if you're going to do PK, you could pre-specify that I'm going to exclude from the analysis people who have zero blood level. That's potentially possible. But you're right, that's another source of failure of trials. Absolutely. You've said for years.
Has anybody done that with an accepted trial? I'm not aware of that.
Not yet.
It makes sense. But also then they say, well, how do you know they weren't taking placebo? And so you have to put a marker in the placebo, and then you have to measure that they were taking placebo as well.
That's right. That's exactly right. All right. Well, there are some, some biomarkers in development to look at who's a placebo responder potentially and who's not. And there are some certain personality characteristics. Okay. But that's just us old clinical trial grizzled veterans here. Let's talk a little bit more about the psychedelics. You, Scott, just literally 2 days ago got published online a very interesting trial of psilocybin for bipolar II depression. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I've gotten funded by Compass Pathways to do several different IITs. This is the first one I'm publishing. I've got one other that I'm just writing up, and another one that I'm still working on, which is actually my field, as you know, Andy, is everybody else's disasters. So I tend to specialize in all the depressive outliers. So the 3 studies I will be reporting on, and the first you're seeing now is on bipolar type 2 depression. I also have a study on basically VNS type folks who failed 5 or more treatments in the current episode. So that's currently, I'm writing that up. And then I have another trial in which I'm looking at folks with chronic active suicidal ideation. So these are folks who pretty much are waking up every morning wondering if today is the day I'm going to kill myself. So these are all on a CSSRS. These are all folks who are 3s and 4s. I don't have any 5s and I don't have any 2s.
Yeah.
But for the bipolar 2 folks, these are all folks who have already been diagnosed with bipolar type 2, who have failed at least 2 treatments in the current episode. Mm-hmm. And largely it was, because all the patients came to me pretty much either through word of mouth, through the Shepherd website, or through clinicaltrials.gov. And we had 15 patients in an open label study. I didn't exclude people except if they had a current substance use disorder, if they were currently suicidal. But I wanted everybody to have bipolar type 2 depression. I wanted them to be depressed in the current episode for at least 3 months. And most of these folks have actually been depressed for years in the current episode. So we put I took everybody off all their psychotropic medication. Mm-hmm. There was one person who, when I took her off her medication, became real clear that she couldn't tolerate being off medication. She was dropped from the study.
Sure.
Pretty much everybody else I was able to get off medication. I wanted them off for 2 full weeks before they were dosed with 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. And did the standard type treatments, and pretty much I copied what I had done in the phase 2 trial that I mentioned before. So everybody had 3 preparatory sessions prior to dosing, had an 8-hour dosing session with 2 therapists, and had 3 integration sessions starting the day after the dosing. And Andy, the numbers I had, if it wasn't my own data, I wouldn't believe it. My primary outcome measure was in 3 weeks, but I followed people for 12 weeks. Right. At 12 weeks, 12 out of the 15 people met criteria for remission.
You're kidding. At 12 weeks?
At 12 weeks.
It held a charge that long. Well, that's interesting.
And pretty much there were 3 people who were not remitters or responders at week 12. And what's curious is they all had sort of individual issues. One of them had some cognitive type disturbance and we knew his neuropsychological testing before. Yep. One of them was somebody who actually initially responded but didn't want to participate in the psychotherapy aspect of it. Okay. He was one of those people who wanted the pill to make him better. But what was curious is even with him, even though he was the one dropout that you'll see in the study, that he dropped out at, I forget if it was 6 or 9 weeks, having relapsed. But what he did do a couple of weeks after is he had another course of ECT, which he had failed before the dosing, and he now responded to ECT.
Wow, that is fascinating.
And then another person had really a lot of cluster B kind of traits and probably was not an ideal candidate. But even with her therapist said, this is the first time I've been able to do therapy with her after the dosing. Again, it didn't last for long enough with her.
Yeah. But
everybody else had these pretty remarkable responses, even to the point that when I'm doing grand rounds these days, I have 2 slides just on quotes from my patients in studies, and primarily actually from this bipolar 2 study, where I have people saying things like, before the world was in black and white, and now it's in color. Before I felt like I was breathing through a straw, and now I can take a deep breath. One of my patients was somebody who had intrusive imagery, very, very vivid imagery of her dying in these horrific manners.
Oh, boy.
And after the dosing, these images, these intrusive images, didn't go away, but they were now in black and white, not as vivid and not as provocative as they had been before. We had actually recently been in touch with her. She stayed in remission for 18 months after a single dose.
That's hard to believe. And did she keep up with therapy during that time?
She kept up with therapy. And a lot of the folks that were involved with the study were people who were really very high on self-care scales. So this is somebody who was a nurse and as well was a yoga instructor, ate very well. But she really changed after the dosing. She became less dependent on the support of her patients to feel good about herself, and sort of has really had a transformative experience.
Yeah. Well,
I had another patient in one of my studies, just to give you the example of what I'm hearing, is he called me up. He also went into remission after a dosing, called me up after a year. He was depressed again. And I said, hey, before we figure out what we're doing next, is anything still different or better? To which he said, I still don't hate my parents. Which I absolutely loved, because what it really showed is he was able to get out of this sort of cognitive rut he had been in, and to actually have a different relationship with his parents that was persistent for him. So that's another thing that I've seen is I don't think we're actually capturing the changes a lot of us are seeing with psychedelics, because it's not just that appetite or sleep is better. It's that the real change is really on self-regard. Mm-hmm. It's really on anhedonia, much more than it is on the classic vegetative symptoms.
Yeah, no, that's something I strongly agree with you, that our current rating scales don't capture things even that are most important to our patients, to be honest, but they're a necessary evil for, again, regulatory trials.
It is kind of crazy. You mentioned I'm also involved with a lot of vagus nerve stimulation research, and there too, one of the things that we have found in subsequent analyses of the cohort I reported on back in 2017 is that you actually get larger changes more quickly on quality of life issues than on depression issues. So there was this really, really lovely paper that my good buddy Chuck Conway did, where he looked at how much of a MADRS, a Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, had a drop to get a meaningful change in quality of life, and it was less for the VNS patients than for the non-VNS patients.
And this reminds me of some of Kuhn de Mittenayer's work, where he actually looked at two types of symptom profiles. One was what the doctor wanted to get better, and one is what the patient wanted to get better. And the doctor wanted bad symptoms to go away, and the patients wanted good feelings to come back. And I'm wondering if that's what you're seeing.
That's it, right. Steve, that's exactly right. And actually the paper, John Kuhn and I wrote a paper that was in Australian New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry on the whole methodology of changing the thinking process from difficult to treat, from treatment-resistant depression to difficult to treat depression. And one of the reasons we wanted Kuhn involved in it is because of, we're trying to change how we look at depression. It's not an acute illness that we throw on medication, we make better, and you ride off into the sunset. This is a chronic condition which needs to be treated often over a lifetime. And, we need to change what our outcome measures are, and we're better off figuring out what's meaningful for the patient than what's meaningful for the Montgomery-Asberg scale.
I thought it was all about us.
Well, it is about us, but, the point for me, when my patients get better, I feel better.
Yeah, I'm being cynical, of course. So I think he made an excellent point, and that maybe the better way to rate psychedelic outcomes would be with the return of positive symptoms rather than the abatement of negative types of symptoms.
Because the other problem is within chronic depression, often your sleep and appetite normalize. Those are really harbingers of acute depressions. And for the chronic depressions, which is pretty much what we're looking at in a lot of these studies, that's not where the action is.
Yeah, it really is about wellness. I often, when I teach, Scott, I'll ask the audience, by the time a patient comes to see you, how long have they been depressed? How long have they had symptoms? And you hear months, years went on. And then I say to them, okay, so why now? Why are they coming to see you now? And it's usually quality of life, function, self-concept, those kinds of things. So, and yet we're stuck with these symptoms that we have to hit a threshold to make a diagnosis. Regulatory authorities to approve a drug still rely on those. But yeah, I think we're absolutely on the money here. That's not always what matters to the patients. Yeah. Steve, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to put you on the spot. You have not always been as a big a fan of psychedelics as some others. What do you think of what Scott is saying here in his experience?
I have not been a fan of the idea that you have to go on a trip.
Okay.
I like the fact that the psychedelics seem to produce neuroplasticity. So it seems to me that we talk a little bit about the placebo response rate and stuff. It's very difficult to dissect apart the expectancy effects and the unblinding.
That's right.
You have generally enthusiastic patients going into trials with enthusiastic investigators. When it goes out in the real world, you'll have cynical patients who don't even want to be treated with investigators who are just trying to make money and don't really, have the same cathexis into the situation. Mm-hmm. So I actually am skeptical that you have to go on a trip. I've had debates with, I don't know where Scott falls on this, we'll find out in a second, but with Guy Goodwin, who does think that, and we have friendly disagreements. And I'm much more interested in the little companies. There's about a half a dozen of them who are trying to factor out the psychedelic experience as a behavioral toxicity and keep just the neuroplastic outcomes and using molecular kinds of mechanisms to dissect that. There's one drug that's in development by one company that actually is very interesting. We think the psychedelics work through 5-HT2A receptors. Right. Some of them are on the inside of the cell. But in one particular drug's case, it doesn't. It seems to be derived from some of the same structures as do bind 5-HT2A receptors and do have hallucinations. But in the case of this drug, it doesn't bind to 5-HT2A receptors. It doesn't have an animal model for psychosis, which is the head twitch response, but is neuroplastic. Right. It's going in demand now, but guess what? It is blocked by 5-HT2A antagonists, even though it doesn't engage the 5-HT2A receptor. So funny stuff is going on with the serotonin system. Yeah. And I'm wondering if we can have our cake and eat it too, Scott, which is that can we get the effects that you're saying without having the person have a trip?
Yeah, and I think it's a very active question. And obviously there's a lot of people who are staking lots of money on it because if you have to have a trip, it gets much more expensive to do the treatment.
That's right.
Because I have to have them, taken care of in a special dosing room and have to watch them. Right. One of the things that we have seen is I am collecting data on the 5D-ASC scale, which is a marker of how much of a psychedelic experience you have. And I did report the data in this paper that was in JAMA Psych this week, which is we did find a relationship between the magnitude of the psychedelic experience and the likelihood of response. What's interesting that I'm not clear about is it really just that the psychedelic trip is a marker for how much neuroplastic change you get, or is the actual psychedelic piece of it necessary? That I'm really not sure about. I'm actually kind of agnostic on the issue. My experience, though, has been that the few folks I've seen who have not had a psychedelic experience, despite having an adequate dose of psilocybin, do not tend to do well. And I've had a couple of those, particularly in my severe TRD study. And we're going to see more of those, actually, as we start looking more in a PTSD population, because it's really hard for a lot of PTSD folks to let down their guard to allow themselves to have a larger psychedelic experience. And I think that's why they need to be dosed likely more than once, as happened in the MDMA trial, sponsored by MAPS.
Let me make a prediction here, which is that if the psychedelic experience proves to be necessary, and we're going to use natural products that are basically not patentable, my sense is that this will never be FDA approved. It'll never be promoted in a traditional sense for pharma, and it will become part of the lore of certain psychiatric practices, particularly those that can spend a lot of money. People can pay a lot of money. A little bit like the way in which cannabis is being used now, which is largely unregulated, just kind of legally done. And maybe that's the destiny of this. I'm hoping there's actually a drug in there, and that you can have a non-hallucinatory experience with neuroplasticity and a novel chemical entity, possibly dosing more than once. But that's the pharmacologist in me talking.
Well, Steve, Compass already has a proprietary synthetic version. So what I'm concerned about, I think there will be ways to make proprietary things, but I think the problem's going to be if, Oregon has legalized psilocybin. So you're right that if people will go out and use these unregulated versions, so that's a risk.
Yeah, and the other thing that we didn't mention from my bipolar 2 study is the anecdotal literature about the use of psychedelics in a bipolar population is that it's got a high risk of causing mania or causing persistent hallucinations, which I did not find during the study, but there is a huge gulf between recreational use and clinical research kind of use. And Steve, I worry as well with you that we need to avoid going down that THC pathway because we really, legalizing psychedelics without having a regulatory environment that makes sure that we're doing this and administering it correctly and to the right people is really critical. One of the things that happened with my article is the editor-in-chief of JAMA Psych, really reached out to me to make sure that I was being really clear not to extrapolate my results to a bipolar 1 population who he feels to be at significant risk for bad reactions to psychedelics. And I agree with him. And try to be quite clear, and to make it real clear, hey, we're professionals. Please don't try this at home, because I do think that there is a risk profile, and the same way that I think that there's a risk profile of all these different companies trying to figure out what's proprietary and what's licensable, which I think is critical. And I'm to be honest, I'm not even sure what the financial model is going to be moving forward, because a lot of companies are trying to move away from requiring a psychotherapy component. A lot of companies are trying to see if we can get the same bang for our buck out of a a psychedelic-like drug that doesn't cause a psychedelic experience. And I'll tell you, Steve, my bet is that the non-psychedelic drugs will have an efficacy, but it won't be as great as the ones that actually have a psychedelic experience. Because I have a feeling at the very least, it's a marker for the degree of neuroplastic change.
Well, the other thing is, notwithstanding the lack of regulation, if this doesn't get approved, the question is always going to be with these polymorphous, you could say dirty or whatever, but multivalent receptor on serotonin. If they hit the 1B receptor and the 2B receptor as an agonist, there's going to be a limited number of doses you can give. Otherwise, they're going to cause valvulopathies. So, if people are unregulated, some of them, how many doses are they going to take, and do they know that this could hurt their heart?
Right. It's very analogous to ketamine and PCP. I mean, we know if you give sub-anesthetic, careful doses, it's therapeutic. But people who abuse it, there's all kinds of toxicities out there. So it's actually very analogous to that. Yeah.
And, I don't know that we've done a great service by legalizing THC, because I think that a lot of us wind up seeing a whole host of people with chronic psychotic disorders who actually get made worse by use of THC.
I don't know if you guys saw that, but there was an announcement just came across my email today from Robin Murray at the Institute of Psychiatry in the Maudsley Hospital in London. He's actually starting a clinic specifically for those people who have psychosis caused by cannabis and for remaining stuff. And he's trying to look at them and saying, because he estimates that maybe up to 40% of psychotic episodes in London could be mitigated if high-potency cannabis was not available. So we wonder whether we don't want to start a new epidemic of psychedelic-induced psychosis. So those are just the safety issues that are out there as well. That's why I would prefer, also for regulatory reasons, we don't know how to approve drugs very well for one dose. And so the question is, we had a little company called Sage get in trouble by even just giving 2 doses and stopping it. We don't know how to deal with that really
2 weeks,
in terms of design. So my dream would be to have to take, in other words, a bad analogy for me from the Midwest. It says there's a pile of manure and the boy's a little happy because he says there's got to be a pony in there. And so the pony in there is maybe a drug that doesn't cause valvulopathy, doesn't cause hallucinations, does cause neuroplasticity, and you can take chronically. So that, if we can pull that out of there, I think we've got a breakthrough. Otherwise, I think it's going to be, it's just innovations can come from things that we don't expect that are off off-piste of the way we usually ski down this hill. But that's what my dream would be.
You're talking about the so-called second-generation psychedelics is what they're calling them now. Scott, what do you think?
My suspicion, and the only place I really disagree with Steve, is I have a feeling that there is something in the psychedelic experience, just because, and I actually, between all my different investigator-initiated protocols, I've now got a whole assemblage of people that we have 5D-ASC scores on, and we'll just have to see whether it's holding up, that there is something magical about having the psychedelic experience. My opinion, but again, it's as a clinical researcher early in this paradigm, is it seems to be of some help, but I can't assure you that it's absolutely required. And I think that the other question that a lot of people are having is this whole therapy component required?
Right,
because that's
exactly.
part of the expensive piece of it. And one of the things, I actually don't think of psychedelics as an antidepressant per se. I think of it as opening a doorway to be able to change some of your cognitive processes that are helped by being able to use what you get from that psychedelic experience. So I think that it's real helpful, and I think that that's actually one of the things that a lot of biological psychiatrists have been poorly informed about the fact that if you've got neuroplastic changes, you can actually magnify them by coupling it with therapy. I actually had an interesting interchange with Carlos Zarate, and Carlos, God bless him, has been the real leader in the development of NMDA antagonists for depression. Right. And I was sitting next to Carlos at a meeting, and Carlos looks at me and he says, "Why don't you do a study of psilocybin without therapy?" To which I said, "Why don't you do a study of ketamine with therapy?" And it was really, Carlos and I still like each other, but it really shows this kind of impasse that we've got. I don't think everything is going to happen through throwing drugs at people. And I think, all of us who've been clinicians, and all three of us have been very active clinicians. And I dare say I'm pretty clear that therapy is a huge help. And I think therapy coupled with psychedelics is like therapy on steroids. There is a process you can engage in that's actually pretty significantly more rapid than standard therapy.
Well, I'm going to throw a cautionary note into that. I both agree with you, and I'm afraid of it. I mean, it would be nice if that worked, but have you guys read or are aware of the book that my colleague at UCSD, Joel Dimsdale, wrote? It's called Dark Persuasion. And
yes, we did a podcast with him, Steve.
Yeah, they use. We have a podcast with him, and I actually gave an APA symposium with him. I think 2 years ago, and he's talked about the use psychedelics were first used when they were resurrected from the indigenous tribes by the CIA to try to brainwash people and coerce confessions. And the worry is that if you have a vulnerable person that a skilled and well-meaning psychotherapist could help, could you also have a situation where people could be exploited in various ways, financially, sexually, etc.? And so we can't guarantee that open window of trying to being able to influence people will always be used skillfully or for good nature. So I'm hoping that you don't need it, because I think it's going to be hard to regulate that.
Yeah, and I think that's actually come up as a problem in the phase 2 MAPS trial, where actually one of the therapists, after dosing somebody with MDMA, climbed into bed with the study subject. And it's part of the reason why the FDA, from its safety concern, has required us to have 2 therapists. We've changed it now that I need one therapist in the room and one therapist can be watching on closed circuit. But Steve, that is a real problem, and it's particularly real during the actual dosing, although there is certainly a risk afterwards. And there are people who are writing experiences about having been exploited by therapists. I was actually just asked to speak at the annual meeting of the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Society on the risks of psychedelics, and that is one of the real risks, is that we are making people more suggestible and potentially being able to create boundary violations that are breathtaking. So I sadly do think that that's a risk, and it's part of the reason why we need to be really regulated, because you really worry about people who order their shaman hat online from eBay and set up their clinic to be dosing folks with drugs that can make them more amenable for sexual indiscretions.
Well, let me also be optimistic, if I could, as well. I cautionary note, certainly, and I encourage people for fun just to look at Dimsdale's book, Dark Persuasion, but is also from a neurobiological perspective, Scott. I don't know if you ever think this way, but there's an issue about having problems in your life being a form of memory. Whether it's PTSD certainly is a form of memory, but maybe many of the experiences that people have in depression are almost a form of your circuit learning. Well, when you learn something or get a symptom, if that's the proxy, you basically store it. That's called consolidating a memory. And when you actually are having the memory again, which can be induced by these psychedelics, it becomes plastic, malleable, and changeable. And that's a biological process, so that if you have a memory, you can store it again with other things attached to it, so you can modify the memory. But you can also forget it, because when you reconsolidate, you can disrupt it. So from a neurobiological point of view, let me ask you this. Can you forget your depression, Scott? Can you forget your addiction? Can you forget your PTSD? And if so, then maybe we can use this as an experience to do that, because it may well require some sort of guided, psychotherapy during that vulnerable period where your memory is not, you're having it and making it vulnerable to disrupting reconsolidation. And of course, you don't want to remember your PTSD. So do you think that could help?
I am 100% with you. I'd phrase it a little bit differently, because I don't think you really will forget your traumatic event, but I think you get to file it away in a different place in a way that is less toxic. I have not done a PTSD study, but as you can imagine, when I did my study of severe TRD, of my 12 patients, 5 of them had comorbid PTSD.
Yeah.
These were also the 5 who were least likely to be responders in that study. But I'll tell you the experience of one of my subjects. And this is somebody who I knew she had been traumatized. I actually didn't realize what the real trauma was until after the dosing. She had been, she was a woman in her 30s, still in school, learning to be in one of the mental health professions. But at the age of 16 had been, her mom had suggested she spend the summer working in a Romanian orphanage, which wound up being very, very, very traumatizing for her. And it was a level of vicarious traumatization that was overwhelming. And in fact, what happened after the dosing session, and this is part of the reason I love having really experienced therapists being my psychedelic psychotherapist, is at the end of the dosing session, she was curled in a fetal position, sobbing. And she looks up at me and she says, I was back. And, this had happened 16 years ago. And she said, I was back. I have not been that miserable since I stopped working at that orphanage. She never met response criteria during the whole study. However, a year later, she's in a very different place. She has finally completed her degree, which she was having trouble completing. She is in a relationship, has had a child, and is functioning like an adult for the first time in her adult life. And there feels to me that there was something very essential that happened in that the traumatic memories somehow became less toxic and less in her way in terms of her pursuing her adult life. So, and I think that there's a reason why other targets for psychedelics are things, and when I'm giving grand rounds, I say, any illness that restricts your thinking, that, cripples you because of, behavioral issues or addictive issues is a potential target. And my buddy Matt Johnson, who'll be joining my program in February, he's been looking at nicotine addiction and has had terrific results, and is pursuing, and he actually, God bless, has got the first NIDA money ever in 50 years to look at psychedelics. So I do think that, I'm not sure you forget about the trauma, but you detoxify it in some way. And the other thing is, you'll hear, so many people have had an ability to stop abusing substances after a psychedelic experience. And that literature that was from the late 60s, if I recall. A lot of it was from Canada. They were not terribly well-controlled studies, but they were studies looking at LSD in chronic alcoholics, and the response rate was something on the order of 70% of these people were still sober a year after use of LSD. So there is something, and I do think that there's a lot of different indications, and we still haven't figured out necessarily how to use them. But the other problem is there's a whole bunch of people trying to get access to it outside of formal clinical.
Well, Scott, as usual, you're more precise and brilliant than I. And so it turns out that I think that a sort of a lay way of sloppily describing this is forgetting. If you want to get neurobiologically more precise, you're actually on the money in the sense that when you have a memory, there's some question whether you ever forget it, particularly the more emotionally charged ones. But what, at least in rodents, it appears, is that certain memories are actually inhibited. And so what you're actually doing is you're generating a synapse that inhibits the memory. But it's always there. And actually, the ability to actually lose that inhibitory component to your memory, whether it's an addiction or whatever, is very easy. It's a lot easier to forget your memory, or actually to lose this inhibitory repression of a bad memory than it is to get that memory in the first place. And so maybe learning how to actually skillfully get the brain to actually block these memories is really what is happening, and rather than in fact really forgetting them.
Yeah, and I got to say, I haven't been the biggest fan of Michael Pollan, just because I worry that he's a journalist who wants to be the story rather than the journalist. But I do love the title of the book, which is How to Change Your Mind, because I think that we're really looking at being able to change people's minds in that, that things become less sticky.
Well, we're all changing our minds. In fact, listeners hopefully have changed their minds since the last hour. So if we can just do that for good use, then more power to us.
But as with any great tool, I am very aware as well of that the tools have to be used skillfully, and the fact that I can do some pretty incredible things with some people with really bad mood disorders, it is a double-edged sword, and because you are making people more vulnerable, and we have to be aware of that, and this should not just be something that you can pick up at the corner store and go home, have your trip, and all of a sudden your life will be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so well said. It's so true. There's all kinds of potential for abuses now, even with what we do now, and so this maybe magnifies and heightens that. But really what we need is more science. We need more people looking like you, Scott, agnostically, generating the research and the data. And what I love is your fusion of data and the patient's experience. I love hearing those quotes from the patients, and I think we learn best from our patients and from the cases that we talk about with each other.
I don't think I've ever done research that has changed me as much as the psychedelic research, because it really has changed even my vision of what depression is.
Say more about that.
But I'm looking... and it's so related, in fact, to what Steve was talking about, that Kuhn de Metenier was talking about, which is, what has meaning to the patient versus what is this number I have to tick off on a scale. I think that people get trapped in belief systems that are incredibly problematic. And in some ways, I am brought back to when I first became a psychiatrist, a long time ago. I've had my 40th med school reunion already. So been doing this for a while, and I remember when I first went into psychiatry and being amazed that depending on what somebody's mood state was, what was in front of them could either be inedible or a feast. And,
Right.
and I'm
Right.
back to that
Right.
kind of perspective
Right.
that this is a means to help people change their vision of themselves and the world around them. So much of depression has so much of a component of self-loathing that we don't really talk a lot about.
Yeah.
And that seems to be one of the best targets for whatever it is that we're doing with psychedelics. That self-perception appears to be more amenable to change with this than anything else I've ever done. And, I started, my career as a researcher was started back when I was a resident and watching, my mentor was Alan Schatzberg, and he was doing some of the original fluoxetine trials.
Yes.
And that was really kind of cool. And this is the first time I've seen something that in some ways is as cool as that was.
Yeah, you and I were chatting earlier. We have entered the third phase of psychopharmacology. The first in the 50s and 60s with the typical antipsychotics, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, tricyclics. The phase you're talking about that you and I sort of entered was the second phase with the SSRIs and the atypicals. And now we've gone beyond monoamines, and we're entering this other phase, which, the second phase wasn't really so much about efficacy, Scott, I think, in some ways as safety and tolerability. I think now we're entering an efficacy phase. I think we're really changing the paradigm, as you said.
Absolutely. And I, part of the reason I'm not ready to retire is that I've never seen such interesting stuff. My expression about my career is A, don't always know what I'm doing. B, I am never bored. And I got to say, this has been just a wonderful time to be a research psychiatrist. And, I'm just fascinated with what I get to deal with. And my staff is seeing, things that they would never expect to see.
Yeah,
well, don't retire. You're making a big difference, and we certainly enjoy watching your innovation and your contributions.
Well, I feel, and I do want to give a shout out to Compass Pathways, who, they have really been terrific supporters of several different of these investigator-initiated protocols. And so, I get to do cool stuff with their support, because it's been really, really hard to get for clinical trialists to certainly get non-industry money to do interesting studies, because everything from NIMH is so mechanistically oriented.
Yeah, guys, we didn't even get into talk about the history of this and how we're kind of coming around full circle. And we didn't get to talk about the politics that interfered with this and led these drugs to be Schedule I. That's a whole nother podcast. But I think since we're paying homage, in a sense, or we're thanking people, we owe a real debt of gratitude to David Nutt in England, who was part of a wave of people who actually were able to resurrect this as a legitimate scientific study and try to strip away some of this baggage of the politics of this.
David is one of my heroes. Another of my heroes that I really just want to bring up his name is Rick Doblin. Because Rick has, for 37 years and counting, has been working tirelessly to get MDMA available for people with PTSD.
Yes, well said.
And they have now done 2 randomized phase 3 randomized controlled trials. They're getting this package together for the FDA. It looks like it won't go in this year, but I think hopefully next year. It has breakthrough status with the FDA. Yes. And Rick is one of the most genuine, self-effacing kind of guys, and one of those guys who I will disagree with, but he's not one of those people who's spends a lot of time trying to prove to you that he's right. He says, hey, we're going to agree to disagree. And that's really been a labor of love. It's a nonprofit organization.
MAPS.
Really, I have not worked with MDMA, but have already had conversations that should it become available, is my plan would be to have my site being one of the first clinical sites for a rollout of MDMA.
Yeah, the brain doesn't know the difference between legal and illegal. These are chemicals that have effects on the brain, right? And so it'd be nice to be more scientific and agnostic about this.
Well, it's interesting. We have a book proposal in with Michael Burke and one of his colleagues, Stahl to say recreational drugs repurposed for medicinal use. And when you look at it, almost every recreational drug can be repurposed. And, not just the psychedelics, of course, and ayahuasca and cannabis, but also betel nuts. If anybody on this call recalls, there happens to be a drug that has been filed for schizophrenia treatment based upon the betel nut, although it's called arecoline, and it was then turned into xanomeline. So, when you start looking at it, and there's ketamine, and there's MDMA, and then there's even the stimulants could be seen as repurposed recreational drugs.
Benzodiazepines, of course.
So, the idea is you need to be open-minded to it and some of the innovation. And, these people that have actually shifted the paradigm by, like David Nutt and so forth, really, we owe them a debt to open our eyes and generate a whole new area.
I agree. Well, Scott, can you please, if you don't mind, say what you told me off air earlier about what are the next 10 years going to hold? The next 10 years.
Even as I am at my core pretty cynical, sarcastic scientist, but I got to say, I do think psychiatry will change more in the next 10 years than it has in the last century, because we're starting to have even though we still don't know what causes most of the illnesses we treat, we seem to be getting a new purchase to be able to change it. And I think that the two roads, and it's actually where most of my research is in psychedelics and NMDA antagonists, as well as neurostimulation, I think will change what we can do and to relieve suffering in so many folks we haven't been able to touch for my whole career.
Wow. Well, so well said. And what a wonderful place to end. And it is an optimistic, finally an uplifting note. We have run out of time. Guys, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this. And I always enjoy our conversations, Scott, offline, off the air. And I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and your opinions. I want to thank you, the audience, for listening. I hope this has been valuable for you in any number of ways. And for more information about our other educational offerings, please go to our website, NEIglobal.com. We have a whole series of podcasts in the Psychopharmastahlogy series. You can get them wherever you get your podcasts. And so I just want to say thanks, Scott. Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the NEI Podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today. For more information about NEI and our premier educational content, please visit NEIglobal.com.